Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum to all my Muslim friends, and good evening to Pakistanis, and good afternoon to people watching in Greece, and good greetings to all the people watching in different regions around the world. So, today we are going to discuss the topic of neoliberalism. We had the introductory conversation about neoliberalism just previously, and we discussed what is neoliberalism. We had an introduction of neoliberalism, and we discussed what is its meaning and what are the agendas of neoliberalism. And today we are going to take this discussion one step further. And as I told you that I am fond of discussing different philosophies like capitalism and communism, and I believe that we have taken the first step in that direction thanks to Mr. Jon Kofas from Greece, who is a professor of history, and he has researched it very well. So today he told us in the last week about neoliberalism, and today he's going to tell us how it is going to influence the Western education system in the US, especially after the controversy of Claudine Day and her controversial revelation from Harvard University. And it all came amidst the criticisms and allegations of anti-Semitism. Actually, it's not anti-Semitism, you can say Zionism, a criticism of Israel and atrocities on Palestine. So we are going to welcome Mr. Jon Kofas, and we are very thankful to have him here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's great to be with you once again. This is a very important topic. As you noted, the most recent controversy is linked to the current conflict, the war that Israel is carrying out in Gaza against the civilians in Palestine in the Gaza Strip, but as well as the West Bank, by the way. The issue of higher education is very, very important. It is a reflection of the values of any society from the ancient times, from the time of Confucius and Plato to the present, that the individuals in the United States who were able to have enough institutional influence to have two university presidents, namely Liz Magill from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as Claudine Gay, as you pointed out, from Harvard. And they're also going after, by the way, the president of MIT, Sally Kornbluth, among others, by the way. The fact that these people have that kind of influence to be removing, to put enough pressure to have, not they didn't themselves remove, but they have enough influence that they had these presidents of university removed. This is a reflection of how the neoliberal model in education has made that possible. And that is linked, of course, to domestic as well as foreign affairs, the domestic policy as well as foreign policy. What I would like to do is point out up front that the neoliberal model of education is fairly new. It starts again with Chile under the dictator Augusto Pinochet, who was installed in Chile after the CIA overthrew Salvador Allende, who was duly elected in 1973, and helped to install Augusto Pinochet, a military dictator. And Chile was used by the United States as a laboratory for experimentation. And one of the experiments was the neoliberal model, the application of the neoliberal model. After that model, which, by the way, was successful only for the people who had money, and the majority of the people in Chile did not and do not, then the neoliberal model comes to Great Britain as well as the United States in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And then it spreads out from there to all corners of the world, from South Korea to the Middle East. I want to bring up, because I was in higher education for a long time, for 3 decades, and I want to bring up an issue which is very important, and that is what is education? What is the value of education? What is the purpose of education? Education, especially public education, because neoliberalism targets public education and wants to shift resources from public education to the private sector. In fact, legislation was passed in Greece just this past year to do exactly that with higher education, to shift money from public higher education and to allow private schools, domestic and international. So there is neoliberal education means privatization of education, of the educational system. Now, public education as a concept is not very old. In fact, in the ancient times, whether in Asia, in the Middle East, or in Greece and Rome, the fact is that education was the domain of the wealthy. They had private tutors. It was very rare to have someone of modest background be educated. Socrates was the exception in Greece, for example, who was the teacher of Plato. He was a rare exception. He was a man of very modest means. And there have been people like that. In the Middle Ages, both in Islamic countries as well as in Western Christendom and in the Byzantium, in the Eastern Orthodox world, the church took over education. So education revolved around theology and religious issues. So education has its roots in religion. Now, the first institution of higher education was not in Europe, although Italy has the first European university. It was actually Muslims that came up with the concept of, in fact, in Morocco, but other places in the Muslim world came up with the concept of a universal education, hence the concept of university. The Muslims came into contact with the Byzantines as well as the Europeans through trade, and then the Islamic invasion of the Iberian Peninsula of Spain, and profoundly influenced the civilization of Western Christendom. And the Europeans were influenced by Islamic education, the concept that you're not limited to just theology, but there's mathematics, poetry, art, architecture, engineering. So that the concept of a well-rounded, what we call a well-rounded education, that becomes popular more and more in Europe as Europe begins to modernize after the Renaissance, after the 13th century. And of course, among the most famous of the oldest universities are Cambridge and Oxford in England. The concept, however, it was still limited to up to the 18th century. Education was still limited. There was no public education. It was still limited to the people who had money. For example, the great German theologian Martin Luther came from a middle-class family. He wasn't very wealthy, but the ambition of his father was to have the young man go to school and become a lawyer, I believe. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. At the time, law, by the way, law and medicine, the medical profession, legal profession were deemed in the highest regard. Luther, of course, chose another route. He became a theologian, a university professor and a theologian, much to the disappointment of his father. But even in the 16th century, when Luther was practicing theology, education was still limited to those who had money. You had to have money to go to school. In the 18th century, the 18th century coincides with two very important movements in the Western world, which influenced the rest of the world because the Europeans had already colonized parts of the world, including Latin America, Africa, and they were moving into Asia. And so what you have in the 18th century are the convergence of two very important elements: the industrialization of England and the Enlightenment era, where thinkers of the 18th century from all over Europe agreed that education must be a public good. So the value they placed in education in the 18th century was that it must be universal, everyone must be educated, regardless of class and obviously wealth. Now, that was the ideal. The ideal in the Enlightenment was that if you have educated people, what you're doing is first you're contributing to their own self-discovery and creativity, because every person is creative in different things. Not everybody is creative in the same. Some people are creative in mathematics, others are creative in engineering and architecture. So the idea of the Enlightenment was to have a society where education is a public good, meaning it's paid for by the taxpayer, because the individual, by the individual benefiting, the individual doesn't live in some mountaintop by himself or herself, but lives in society. Therefore, society benefits. So the philosophical goal, and by the way, Immanuel Kant, whom I know you have studied, Immanuel Kant was one of the promoters of this concept of enlightening people. In his essay, What is Enlightenment? Immanuel Kant argued that it is removing the darkness of the past, the superstition, and the way to do that is through education. And let me add something else. This was at a time that the scientific revolution had already taken place in the 17th century, continuing to build on the scientific revolution. The Industrial Revolution saw the material benefits through mass production in England, which began to spread to the continent of Europe. So the concept of public education comes out of the 18th century. And the ideal is indeed for the edification of the individual, the benefit of the individual, the self-awareness of the individual, making the individual a better person, a better citizen, but also derivatively, so all of society benefits because that individual is part of society. And they linked education, and even Peter the Great, who was the Tsar of Russia, and he was more in military affairs, but the fact is Peter the Great was interested in a lot Russian historians to this day and Russian scholars defend this point, that Peter the Great was actually an intelligent man who realized, for example, the importance of Sir Isaac Newton's physics and mathematics, and realized the link between education, a healthy economy, and for Peter the Great, a strong military. And in that order, by the way. In other words, if you're going to have a thriving economy, an industrialized economy, a science-based technological economy, you have to have an educated workforce. People have to be educated. They have to know what they're doing. You start there and you move forward to the industrialization process. And then, of course, industry applied for the absolute monarchs like Peter the Great to the defense sector. So this was the ideal. Now, there was also another dimension in this, and the man whom, as I've said in the previous tape, whom I admire very much, a great American intellectual, Noam Chomsky, points this out in his own work. The other dimension, of course, is that education is also a means to upward social mobility. Let's face it, and the Enlightenment thinkers did not rule that out. The fact is that an educated person will invariably secure a better job, have a thriving career. So you have upward mobility. Someone who is from a modest working class background, if education is free, in other words, public, gets an education and moves into the middle class. So education also has that dimension to it. From the perspective of the industrialists, the bankers, the merchants, the people, the capitalist class in the 18th century, and especially in the 19th century when most of Western Europe industrializes, and then, of course, after the American Civil War, the United States goes full force toward the industrial development, and Japan as well as along with the United States toward the end of the 19th century. So you have Japan and the United States following in the European tradition. What you have is businessmen recognizing that they need an educated workforce. They need the architects, the engineers, the mathematicians, the people to do bookkeeping. That education, that an industrial economy, and as technology, by the way, moving very fast forward, moving very rapidly, required more and more education and more education. And as there is movement of people from the rural areas, because mass migration during the industrial process of any country, from the time of England in the 18th century when it industrialized, to China, of course, in the 20th century, mass migration of these people from the rural areas to the urban. You have to educate them because they're going to work in areas where their education is applicable. So the capitalist class itself recognized the value of education and accepted that, yes, there is a price. You pay taxes, you get an educated workforce. It's an investment ultimately benefiting them because they needed the workforce that knows the talent that knows what it's doing. So the merit-based value system in education is really linked to the Enlightenment era because the Enlightenment promoted that value, namely merit. We have limitations, exceptions to education, and limitations, namely the fact is that the Europeans, as they went all over the world, as you know, and colonized, in the colonies that they took control over, they limited educational opportunities to the elites, whether it was the subcontinent of India or in Africa. And so what you have is that educational access was limited. In the US, of course, they did not want slaves to be educated. And even after slavery, blacks were excluded from many educational systems. They had what is called in the American education system segregation, separate schools for blacks, separate for whites. W.E. Du Bois was the first black more than 100 years ago, 120 years ago or so, who got a degree from Harvard. I think he got a PhD from Harvard. So you have basically very limited access within the public system when as the Europeans use the education system as a reflection of their own values, which were colonial, by the way, based on race and ethnicity. And they did it not only in the colonies, they did it within their own countries. Like I said, the US is a good example of that, where they segregated. So this is where we are with the education system. Now, where does neoliberalism come in? Neoliberalism comes along, and as I pointed in the last session, neoliberalism is a holistic system. It's not about just the political economy. It's about institutional restructuring. So education is no exception. Okay, the media is no exception. No institution is exempt from the neoliberal model. All institutions fall within the matrix of that model. So education is one of those. In the 1980s, and I was in higher education, of course, in the late 70s and in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. And I saw it, but Asad, as you're in it, you don't even notice it. I mean, it's just amazing now. As I reflect back, I was in the system, and the changes come, and you don't even realize. There's something that's not what it was before. From the time I was an undergraduate, for example, to the time I was in the PhD program, to the time I started teaching. But the changes are there. So what took place is the business model, the corporate model, applied to the education system. That was one thing, that education must be like a business. That education is not just about the self and the edification of the individual and self-discovery and the creativity of the creative potential that education helps the individual to bring out and to benefit society, whether that is in art or in engineering or in physics, whatever it may be, whatever creative potential. The goal now in neoliberal education is, how does it link to promoting capital, to promoting the business? And more direct link. And this meant that education itself, that the institution, from elementary all the way to postgraduate, had to be modeled like a corporation. So the administration, and these are the changes that unfortunately I saw. And you don't, like I said, you're in it and you just see it on a daily basis. You don't even think about it, but they were there. They were taking place. So the administration becomes more and more like a business, and the faculty more and more like workers, and the staff, and the students like consumers, as though they're buying groceries, which would be unthinkable in any time in the past that the student is a consumer, and that the institution in many cases becomes a business to the degree that we get in the more mature era of the neoliberal phase. Degree mills, what are called degree mills, in other words, colleges, online colleges that offer degrees that are a piece of paper, they're worthless. Even Donald Trump set up a university. Of course, he had to pay several $1 million back to people that he defrauded. That, there was a judgment on the issue. He was selling. They were selling paper. They were selling. People were not educated, so you have basically education becoming commoditized, and the individual, because neoliberalism means commodification of the individual, not the person, not just the institution. You have basically a structural change in the philosophy of education, in the values of education, in the way it's run, the way it was run, in everything. And you see more and more, you see this, of course, and we'll talk more about this, in the salaries of the top administrators. So, for example, you may have university presidents of some of the largest universities making millions of dollars, and then a part-time faculty member who is making a few $1,000s a year. And so really a situation that's unbelievable, that mirrors what is going on in the private sector with regard to a management labor relationship. I want to. First, I want to stop and ask if you want to, because I've been talking too long. If you want to ask anything, and then I'll continue with the corporate model of education.
Okay, Mr. Kofas, so far what I have understood with this conversation is that this whole concept of creating establishing these academic institutions, like this whole model, which we have been seeing for this past 3 to 4 centuries, it's all about making money. And what I have analyzed with what you have told right now is that this system, is not to teach morality to children. They are just robots. They are just machines who are trained to become employees.
Yes, Asad, I want to make one point clear, which this emerges in the 18th century. It's debated in the 19th century, really debated in the 20th century, which is the point that was made during the debate in the United States when Claudine Gay and Liz Magill came before a committee, a House committee, on charges that they were anti-Semitic, which, of course, in the U.S., anti-Zionist means anti-Semitic. And that is the issue of academic freedom. It was taken for granted, and both the political elites in Europe and the U.S., Canada, Australia, in other words, in the Western world, and then that transmitted out to the rest of the world, accepted as a given that if you provide academic freedom, that is when you get the best result from a researcher, a teacher. You get the best out of that person. If you regiment, you don't. You're not going to get much. You create what you just mentioned, robotic students, you're going to have robotic faculty. You're not going to get, so the idea, for example, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, Albert Einstein, imagined and a young Albert Einstein being directed by Raytheon, the defense corporation in the United States, making weapons and selling them around the world, saying, okay, you're only going to work on this because work on this formula because this is what our company needs. Now, you may have an interest in the theory of relativity, but it doesn't interest us. You can do that on your own. We're interested in this formula here because, see, we have a direct application for these that will translate into enhancing corporate profits on a quarterly basis. So the idea, but they accept it for a long time. The business world and the political elites said, you know, this is best. Let them provide academic freedom. This meant this was linked to democracy then. If you're going to do that, that means you ipso facto, you accept, the assumption is, oh, that means you have to let them talk. You can't restrict the right to free speech, the right to expression. If I decide to publish something which is not in the mainstream, it's revisionist, it's controversial because it deviates from orthodoxy, from what the political elite and the business elite wants to hear. It doesn't mean it's going to get censored. Under liberalism, it does mean that, because it interferes, and we'll talk about that in relationship with the anti-Semitic charges against these two women, as well as others, by the way, and the connection between that and critical race theory, which predates this, which is very controversial in the United States, by the way, which has a long history of the white establishment resisting the any version that deviated from the official version. Well, okay, yes, there was slavery. Okay, but it was limited to the slave owners. The institutional explanation that this was institutional wide, that there was a culture of racism, that's too embarrassing. Why are you making me feel bad? Which is literally, by the way, a lot of people, when they go and vote, and they did vote in a number of states on the critical race issue, and people who voted, who were actually Democratic registered voters, would vote against it because, and they were, there was a public opinion poll. Why are you voting against it? You're saying you're a liberal. Why are you voting against it? I don't want my children to feel guilty because a long time ago, our ancestors did this. They were racists and so forth. And of course, the counter argument to that is that you don't want them to know what actually happened. So the academic freedom issue is linked to both critical race theory, as well as this business of using anti-Semitism, which is as soon as people, it's anti-Semitic, it's anti-Semitic again. Well, we'll talk more about this at length, in particular for these two poor women that lost their jobs. But the fact is that it's a buzzword that then becomes meaningless. Like I remember, terrorism. It got to the point where you want to baptize anybody a terrorist, you can. It became. I wrote an article about this. And I wrote it in like 2 days, and I didn't think it would get, but it caught on really fast because it was about the generic use of terror. It meant nothing. It's like, it's like generic aspirin or something. Everybody's a terrorist. You don't like them? Okay, that's a terrorist. So you basically have neoliberalism regimenting education. And the question here is, if there is regimentation of the human mind, are you going to get the best results? Like I said, if you had a young Einstein today, and you put that young Einstein in a box, because, let me link this specifically to what's going on in higher education. Grants for research are linked to your topic. Whether you're in biochemistry, it doesn't matter what field you're in, they're linked to your topic. So guess who provides the big grants? Corporations, as well as government. And guess what? There are perimeters to whether you're going to get those that money, because you have to go around what the topics they're interested in. So, for example, when Archer Daniels Biddle and Company, just an example, I don't want to, nothing, just as an example of this company, if it says any kind of agrochemical company says, well, we're interested in this product because we're extracting corn syrup from these crops, and so that's our interest. But you're interested in some wider topic that isn't particularly linked to their corn syrup. Well, you're not going to get the grant. The person who is going to do research is going to get the grant. So research then is linked to all those interests that pay for it, because education is extremely expensive. And there's another dimension. Maybe I should stop here and let you say something, talk about this, and then I'll continue, because the other issue, of course, is the massive amount of money, billions of dollars in endowments, which brought both of these two women down, the college endowments. And the money issue is very important, because public money is allocated to education, and the state decides, okay, how am I going to use this money? And they have the right to cut from here and put money over here. And this is how the neoliberal model has expanded, because both the state and the private sector use the power of money to mold the institution.
Okay, so you were just talking about the corporate model of the. What is that about? I mean, let me ask you about that. You were saying that you were going to discuss about the corporate model of this, this entire thing.
Okay, the corporate model, and there have been a number of studies, a number of articles, as well as books, is, and I can even tell you from my own experience, because for 3 years I was the director of the honors program. I remember when I was given the position, the chancellor was from Harvard, and she said, we were having dinner, and she said, you realize, John, from now on, one of the big tasks you have is to go out there and raise money from businesses. And I had no idea. I was an academic. I had no clue. But I said, what do we need money? She said, are you kidding? Scholarships, expanding the program, but also to hiring staff. One of the things that happened under neoliberalism, the corporate, is that the administration becomes like top management, high salaries, and the gap, when you look at statistics between 1980 and 2020, that 40-year period, you see that gap in salaries, teachers to administrations, widening. That's one thing. That's the corporate model. Just like CEOs, if you follow the same graph, if you look at workers' wages in 1980 versus 2020, and you factor in inflation, by the way, you have to factor in inflation. What you see is that that the real what is called real wages in economics, declines for workers. It goes way up for management, especially top management, corporate CEOs, and so forth. The other thing that happens under neoliberalism, which claims, by the way, it's against bureaucratization, is there's a vast rise in the bureaucratization that's at the core of the corporate model of the university, of all schools. So they bureaucratize. They have the administration has a great deal of support staff, and that money has to come out of somewhere. It comes out of the teachers, hiring more and more part-time teachers, and keeping the salaries capped. And while the top administration salaries were way up, and there's a bureaucracy that's now running. So it's like a management matrix that's running of a corporation that's running a school. It's a school, by the way. It's not. I mean, this is the most amazing thing. Like I said, I was unfortunately I was part of that as well, and I lived it. And it's true. The other thing that is important here about the corporatization, again, I lived this through as well. One of the local multimillionaires whom I knew, I had met, was a big donor. And those people give money for entire buildings, you know. But then they have, you have to be deferential to them. It's not, okay, here's the money, no strings attached. They make demands on what orientation, ideological orientation, the let's say the School of Business is going to follow. They don't want certain faculty who are, for example, not supportive of that ideological orientation. So what we have is a system where the donors have enormous influence, and this ties in to the donors of Harvard and MIT and Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania. The people who did what they did in connection with Israel were big donors. It wasn't the common person. These are very large donors. And they threatened that if you don't cave, and in some cases the demands were outrageous, not just banning freedom of speech when it comes to Palestine. That was the right to free speech means if you want to support ceasefire in Gaza, you have the right to free speech. If peace becomes a crime? Advocating for peace becomes a crime in Gaza, right? But they had the money not only to say, I'm going to withdraw whatever I'm giving you, but I'm going to have a letter writing campaign to all my friends who are donors, because these people serve on the boards of schools. So they have enormous influence on the policy of the school, on faculty hirings, on programs, and they are able to influence the course of the institution. So that's the corporate model. The corporate model really is linked to endowment funds, to donations for buildings, to donations to buy technology, for example, the latest computers. They are also linked to money given for special faculty positions. For example, an endowed chair that costs enormous amounts of money. Let's say, a couple of million to have an endowed chair started. So you have that sort of situation, and that is how education changes, and the student then, the curriculum becomes much more narrow. It becomes much more vocational. This idea of universal, and the students, my own students, they go, why do I have to study medieval philosophy? I'm going to become a nurse. I don't need this. In other words, the students themselves are drawn into the neoliberal model system and thinking of, I only need to know this much. And then, of course, with internet, once Google became popular, the popular answer was, if I need to know something that's out of my field, I just Google it. Well, hardly the same thing as getting an education. But in any case, this neoliberal mode of thinking becomes universalized. I can also, if you want me to go on to the issue of the firings, by the way, of the two presidents and the pressure on universities, we can also talk about that, unless you want me to. There's another dimension there are a lot of books and articles on it, which is how the neoliberals model of education globally on a world scale has contributed to the downward mobility, because what happens from South Korea and Japan to the Middle East to Turkey to some places, a lot of places in Eastern Europe, including Greece, Western Europe as well, is that the more affluent kids, students, go to the more affluent schools. And on top of that, they have tutors who have to be paid. And so that explodes in itself. There are a couple of interesting articles when I was writing my book on neoliberalism. Some of the best material I came across were from South Koreans, which, of course, South Korea is also immersed in neoliberalism and its education, the same thing, who argue that they're creating a gap in the rich-poor classes through education, precluding upward mobility of the poor, because the poor had education as their ticket to upward mobility. And neoliberalism comes along and cuts it off, limits it. I wouldn't say cuts it off completely, but it limits it. And that's the key here. That the damage that neoliberalism does is to prevent, going back to the model of the 18th century, universal public education for all, so that we can all be uplifted in terms of living standards and go up to the middle class from the working class, from the peasantry. Well, along comes neoliberalism and it undercuts that.
Okay, so this recent issue of the scandal, which has led to the resignation of the Claudine Gray and Lisa Magill. You have just mentioned that these pro-Zionists are basically funding to get them for their resignation. They have created some circumstances which have forced them to resign. So how do you analyze that?
Yes, in looking at that situation, doing some research on both, these women, first of all, both of these were linked to the Democratic Party, to the mainstream, not to the the New Deal wing, which is Senator um, Sanders, Bernie Sanders, which is the progressive wing. They were not linked to that wing. They were linked to mainstream, in other words, to Joe Biden's wing, right? Both, I want to stress this, had a history. Both Liz Magill, whose brother is a judge, she comes from a mainstream, um, middle class Democratic family. Claudine Gay, the same thing. Product of Harvard herself, by the way, Stanford and Harvard. Mainstream Democrats come up through the system, both committed, both very much committed to fighting against anti-Semitism. This is the absurdity of it, that both of these women had a history of that. They were against anti-Semitism. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that these women were in favor of Islamophobia. Do you see the absurdity of it? Okay, I'm against anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean I have to go after these people. I have to turn now and hate these people over here and persecute these people, stop them from talking, and not bring on campus people who are going to promote issues about the very rich culture of Islam in general, and in the case of the conference that Liz Magill was supporting, of at the University of Pennsylvania, of the Palestinians in particular, and they went after this long before this war in the Middle East. Liz Magill permitted, because that's what institutions. When I was an academic, we had, in fact, I had invited people from different parts of the world to come in, controversial or not, they had to have the credentials. Let me put it that way. They had to have once they have the credentials, they're solid. Their views are their views. There were scholars, they were academics, there were people who had their views may not have agreed with those of the majority, but they had the right to express their views. That's the purpose of education. Well, in the case of Liz Magill, she gave the green light to a conference. This was months ago, before this thing happened in the Middle East, for a celebration, sort of a festival of Palestinians and so forth. Invited some of the best people. And immediately, people who were connected with pro-Zionist elements, wealthy people, as well as politicians, including the governor of Pennsylvania, tried to stop her, sabotage the whole thing. And so it isn't the pretext, oh, well, we have a war right now, and you see what Hamas did on October 7th. You have to condemn that. You can't condemn that. Oh, you have to go. Well, this was long before that, when they were going after these people. Now, here's the other interesting thing, that some of these elements link up with critics of critical race theory. Critical race theory is really, it sounds like some mysterious thing, but it's really nothing other than explaining that racism in the United States is institutional and cultural. I used to teach US history. That's how I taught it, because that's how it is. You see, if you study US history, you see that it's not person by person, oh, this person is racist and this person is racist. It's the system. It's the school system. When you have a sign that says whites only, and it's a drinking fountain, you know, and non-whites can't drink from the drinking fountain. And you have a sign that says in this theater, whites only. That's a problem. That's institutional. When you have a school that says whites only, you can't come into the school. So no matter what institution you touch, you have institutionalized racism. How else are you going to approach it other than, and so critical race theory approaches from that angle. So some of those people linked up with the critics of Palestinians and said, well, we can't allow that. Palestinians, you can't have a conference promoting Palestinians because we know that, how do we know that they're not promoting terrorism, blah, blah, blah. So always the issue of terrorism was used, although these were scholars, these were artists and scholars and people, academics. It really had nothing to do with terrorism. Was absurdity. It is the ultimate absurdity. So they were building up to that. And once this war started, which is obviously not a war, but a campaign of genocide against innocent civilians, 70% of women are women and children. The wealthiest, some of the wealthiest people and donors to these universities, who happen to be, some of them happen to be on the board of trustees. They sit on the board of trustees. That gives them enormous power in policy. But the mission statement of these universities states that academic freedom is valued, freedom of expression is valued. If it's not going to be valued in education, where is it going to be valued? Certainly not for a private company. A private company, your boss say, oh, you can't say that, this is a private company, you're fired. In education, no matter whether it's public school or private school, you can't say that. Obviously, they do. In reality, faculty, one of the things people don't realize is self-censorship is a very important component. People know. On my own campus, I remember there were certain people who trusted me, came and told me privately what they thought, but they wouldn't express that publicly ever. And the reason is because they knew they would be stigmatized, their lives would be made difficult and so forth. So they kept it to themselves. So self-censorship, neoliberalism induces self-censorship. It forces you to stop talking. Now, these two women, the ultimate absurdity is both had a record of supporting anything that had to do with discrimination against Jews. They were not Zionists, however, neither of them. Neither was a Zionist. And they were not women who said, I support the policies of the State of Israel. And the large donors, headed by Jewish Americans, of course, but non-Jews on Wall Street, as well as in politics, who are opportunistic, by the way, in politics, use this issue, not necessarily because they could care. And many of these right-wingers, by the way, non-Jewish right-wingers, are themselves anti-Semitic. That's the absurdity of it. They're much more anti-Semitic than the women they get rid of. So privately, if you talk to them, they're actually the real, but they use it because they're right wing. So they use it because it serves a different purpose for them. So you see, the anti-Zionism issue, in a paradoxical way, serves something else over here for those in the GOP, that is in the Republican Party. So both of these women were gotten rid of, and there is pressure against Sally Kornbluth at MIT, and there has been pressure in many other universities throughout the United States, by the way, It's just that the large names, the big names, get publicity. But and because I was on the inside, I can tell you, people keep their mouth shut. They keep quiet, and so they know which way the wind is blowing, and they okay. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not going to say anything. They don't say anything controversial, so that this storm will pass, and they can just survive and move on. Um, but this would not have happened if it were not for the fact that the neoliberal model was not applied to education, and you have corporate types sitting on the board of trustees of universities. I also want to address another dimension of neoliberalism, which is what the value of education has been in the last 40 years. Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out in both of his presidential campaigns in 2016 and 2020 that a college degree today is not the same. It's like a high school degree back in the 1960s. So he proposed, considering we have in the United States college students who owe graduates, they have graduated already, they owe close to 2 trillion in student loan debt. He proposed free education, free tuition, free college tuition. Immediately, mainstream Democrats, and as well as the Republicans and Democrats, and the press, the media, jumped all over him. They were against it. Oh, where's that money going to come from? They were not against the tax cut that Donald Trump gave to the richest 1%, which is close to 2 trillion, by the way. Roughly the amount of money, that the students owe for the loans they've taken out to get an education. But here's the tragedy. Here's the tragedy about that money, close to 2 trillion. The tragedy is that many of those people are not working in the field in which they were academically trained. They're not, for example, if they were academically trained in archaeology, they may have a job in some insurance sales office. The overeducated population is a reality, not just in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, and in Europe. It's becoming globalized. We have way too many people who have college degrees and no jobs at a time that artificial intelligence is rapidly advancing and threatening to take even more of those jobs away. So modern technology is undermining, along with the neoliberal system, is undermining the college graduate. And in the case of the United States, the deeply indebted college graduate. People come out of medical school with, it's not unusual that they owe $300,000-$400,000. They start from scratch, they owe that kind of money. Now you might argue, okay, this woman is going to be a doctor, she's going to make that money. But not in every field do they make that money. There is an increasing number, statistics, US government statistics indicate, of these students who owe money for college debt, who are unable to pay. So they're in default. Those loans are in default. So that's a problem. The opportunities that the economy is creating for the educated workforce under the neoliberal system are not there. Contrary to the promise of the neoliberal model, that it's ideal, that this is the best model because you're training people for the right field. And every time, by the way, there is a recession, every time a corporation, especially the large companies, lay off people by the thousands, and you have rising unemployment, every single time the politicians, the mass media, the business elites, they all come out and say, you know, the problem is theirs. The people who were laid off, in other words, and can't find jobs. It's not the system. It's not the neoliberal system. It's their problem. Why is it their problem? They don't have the right training. They just have to get the right training. And I have been hearing this from the early 1980s to the present, that it's always the fault of the worker. It's never a systemic problem, a structural problem. It's always the fault of the worker. And in the first industrial revolution, interestingly enough, when I used to teach economic history of the industrial revolution in England, I would inform my students that there were a number of intellectuals in England, as well as continental Europe, who argued that if people are poor, it's their own fault. They must be lazy, not educated, or not educated correctly. They lack positive traits, personality, character traits, that it's never the system. And I would ask my undergraduates as well as the graduates, okay, let's say a percentage of the population is exactly the way they're describing it. Let's accept that as a given. Is it possible that the entire world is like that? That everybody has these same traits? And is it possible it's just a working class, which, by the way, is the majority of the population? In other words, you get absurd arguments. And even more absurd is that people accept that. They believe it. And they internalize, especially in North America. In Europe, they're a little bit more protest-oriented. In North America, they internalize, oh, yes, it's my fault. So what do they? They go to a shrink to see how it's their fault that the system in which they were born and molded in created problems that impact their lives. And somehow it's their fault that they don't match that system's evolution.
Okay, Mr. Kofas, that's great. There is one thing that I would like to discuss in this conversation, and that is regarding John Taylor Gatto. He was a professor who retired. He was at the peak of his career, but he left. He left his profession because he thought that he was being cruel to the children. He was teaching wrong things to the children. He was training them to be he thought that he was brainwashing his mind, their minds of the children, and he thought that it was fair to leave this profession, and he wrote a lot of books on it. So
okay,
do you know about him?
Yes, that's an excellent example, because let me broaden that out, because that goes to the essence. Assad, this is a very important issue. What you just raised is a very important issue, and the reason is very simple. What is the purpose of education? Is it to indoctrinate? Noam Chomsky raised it in his own writings, in his own interviews, and this is a very important issue. Is it indoctrination? So that you conform, so that the citizen conforms to a system, conforms to a company. And that is what the neoliberal model does. It wants you to conform. It wants the student to be robotic. from the Enlightenment to the 19th century, the intelligentsia and the influenced sufficiently the political class and the business people to reject that. Because if all you do is indoctrinate, you're not going to get the unleashing of the creative potential of humanity, which can contribute and strengthen, enrich society in all endeavors, from art to sculpture to architecture. A professor or a teacher at the elementary school, even more important, by the way, because that's where the teachers at the elementary school have a profound influence in those young minds. The young mind is like a sponge. It absorbs everything. By the time, that I got them at the age of 18 through 26, they had formulated a lot of ideas. It was much more difficult to indoctrinate. The fact is that education, in many respects, is indoctrination. One of the reasons that you have billionaires and think tanks and institutions from Spain to Australia to the United States spending enormous amounts of money to influence education systems is because they want exactly that. They want indoctrination. Education is liberation. True education is liberation. It's reflecting of the human mind critically and searching for all creative aspects to bring out the best of what it has to offer. It's not regimenting the human mind and putting it in a box. In other words, education is not military service. It's not training you for military service. Okay, do this, do that, or police service. That's not what it is. It's freeing you from that. It's saying, okay, now go ahead, be creative. Obviously, it provides guidelines. However, what happens in the real world is when you have endowed chairs and when you have school superintendents of elementary schools, and the same thing with secondary schools, when you have them beholden to corporate interest, to business interest, to the local community. By the way, you'd be surprised. I was surprised because I had no idea this was taking place when I got into higher education, that the top administrators were actually also serving on bank boards, corporate boards, and then vice versa. Those other people were serving. So there is this symbiotic relationship between education and. When I was director of the honors program, I had, and you have no choice, you have to do it. And I would tell my colleagues how badly I felt about this, just like the example you're pointing out. That I had to be successful, you had to place students, you have to get them jobs. So I had to place students, literally, as they graduate, coming out of the honors program. If they didn't get jobs, who would? And I used connections with school superintendents and businessmen who knew them to get jobs, or banks and so forth. So the relationship is in fact dirty. It's a clientist relation. It's like, that sounds like a third world government type of operation, but that's how it is. It is a system where they, okay, yeah, that's a trusted person. I trust Jon. I trust Jon will bring me good people. I'm going to have those people there. So it works in that kind of a sort of a sleazy way. And then you're asking, obviously an academic, whether it's an elementary school teacher all the way to the PhD program, has a lot of leeway in the classroom But then there are, on the broader scale, because you can deviate, you can say things once in a while that are true and true to reality. But the overall system is all encompassing, and that is what absorbs you, and you are enslaved to it. So the system itself, you succumb to the system because you operate within it. If you're not going to succumb to the system, you get out, like the person pointed out, get out. It is education, its worst forms, and I have seen it, is indoctrination. It's indoctrination toward conformity. I mean, why was Liz Magill and Claudine gay? Why were they fired? Because they wouldn't conform to saying, yes, I am against. Essentially, it was a sleazy way of getting them to admit that they were Islamophobic, by the way. It was sort of a very uncomfortable way of having them admit that they would not tolerate anyone advocating for a ceasefire in Gaza, and admitting that Hamas is all at fault and that it has nothing to do with 75 years of Israeli rule over the Palestinian people in the regimented conditions that they have lived. And these women were, like I said, these women were loyal to their principles of believing adamantly in anything that has to do with condemning anti-Semitism, but they were not going to go the way extra mile, go crazy, and start calling for the suppression of free speech, suppression of academic freedom, suppression of Muslim voices on campus, and so forth. Naming names, by the way, I forgot to point that out. That's all over the press anyway. It's not a secret. Naming names of students who participated, faculty. It gets really ugly. And the interesting thing, I have written about this. The interesting thing is that these are the first people that these pro-Zionist elements want to condemn. These are the first people, the people you're just condemning, that are going to defend Jews when they are discriminated against. And yet you're condemning them because they're not going overboard as you are, to endorse Zionism. So this is a tragedy, really a tragedy. It's a tragedy for higher education, indeed, and then using the issue. Well, they're violating all kinds of ethics. In the case of Claudine Gay, of course, they argued plagiarism. I was on committees where we screened candidates, including administrators. Plagiarism is such a tricky thing, believe me. Let me give you an example. You can have an administrator as a co-author, let's say a third or a fourth co-author in an article. And that person may have done very little, if anything, to contribute to that. Right? And it's perfectly fine, it's perfectly legal. And there's nothing you can do, nothing you can prove. And because everybody knows the research that whatever research that is, it's not relevant to what they're going to be doing. They're going to be administrating. And plagiarism in the age of technology is so ubiquitous. The person who accused Claudine Gay of his wife, it turns out, had plagiarized. So the charge was nonsense because it was known. And it wasn't until the issue of Zionism, which anti-Zionism, which is identified as in the U.S. as anti-Semitism now, until that comes up, that it becomes controversial. And that's a tragedy. That's not the purpose of higher education. Higher education has to be above that. And if it's not above that, people can't be creative and do their jobs and contribute to society if they are going to be on a leash by those special interests who want them to become mouthpieces for their propaganda.
Okay, so analyzing all this entire issue of the impact of neoliberalism on the education system and the controversial resignations of Claudine Gray and Liz Magill, what is the solution to this entire conversation? What do you think is the solution? What is the practical model of education? What is the proper education model which can be useful for the young generations that are going to lead our future? Because we have gone through that. We have spent our lives uh, gaining this education in colleges and universities. We have been following that. You have been in this education profession for so many decades, and I have grown up studying in these institutions, and I gain nothing from that. Practically, if I say I gain nothing from that, what I have learned as a person, all the morals I have learned from my family, my friends, my society, this education gave me nothing. In fact, I have forgotten what I studied in my school days or college days, or when I was studying masters. I have forgotten all of that, and all which I learned, which I read, it has not helped me in any aspect of my life. So, what is the proper model of education which can be helpful in teaching skills and developing the students into better citizens of the society?
Um, that's an outstanding question. It's the key. It's the key to everything. I want to make sure that we understand there must be a balance between the material needs of a student who, once they get the degree, they have to survive. They have to go out there in society, get a job, and survive, get a home, start a family, and so forth. The practical needs. So I don't want to discount that at all. I don't want to dismiss it and say there is a huge difference between that, which neoliberalism is not even delivering, by the way. They promise, but they're not. Okay? And I want to make sure that I make another point very clear, that the ideals of 18th century, that is Enlightenment era education, of public education, were sound ideals. They were bourgeois. They came out of middle class, well-to-do people, but they were universal principles based on the assumption that society is best served with an educated public paid for by society. Once you create linkage between private capital and the education system, the game is lost. Because then the educational institution is beholden to private capital. And that means that I, as a faculty member, can't do a project. For example, if I want to research a lot of the things I used to write about were about the World Bank and the IMF. Now, if the if the grant that I get to do a study on the role of the IMF and the World Bank in Chile is linked to a copper company in the United States, which owns the copper mines in Chile, then all I'm doing is providing a propaganda pamphlet for the copper company. And that's not education. That's not education. Education has to mean unleashing the creative potential of individuals. Now, you pointed something else out that struck me, by the way, and that is, well, I was educated, but it's my family and my friends and my community from which I learned the most. A number of years ago, there was a study at Oxford University that did exactly what you're suggesting. They surveyed, I forget what year, but they surveyed the class of year X. 20 years later, they went and caught up with them. And they found that actually a lot of the things that they had been taught in school, they were oblivious to. It was as though they kept only, and I know this sounds very utilitarian. In other words, whatever you're going to use, and that's it. And the rest, they went back to the beliefs of the community and so forth. This is in England, by the way. And it had to do with everything from physics to culture. I mean, just everything. And so the researchers were astounded. Oh my God, we're educating, but we're not really educating. What are we doing? They were testing. In other words, during the semester, you study this. At the end of the semester, you write, get a grade. All right, I passed that one. I'll move on. The question is, how much have you retained? That's not education, of course. Education really is about the intellectual transformation of the individual. That's education. If there is no intellectual transformation, you might as well have a robot, which, by the way, is being tested as we speak in the United States, artificial intelligence, robotics, as faculty. They're testing them right now. And Harvard is among them, by the way, not just MIT. So, okay, have a robot do it. If you're going to do mechanics, because that's mechanics, have a robot. Education is human transformation, intellectual transformation, human transformation. I was educated. I don't have any complaints in Chicago. And I feel that with my education, I was transformed, studying everything from Hinduism to Islam, to existentialist philosophy, to Keynesian economics, to Piaget's psychology. I was transformed as a human being. In other words, my worldview changed. When your worldview changes, then you necessarily say to yourself, oh, yes, yeah, that happened back then. Otherwise, what you just said and what the people in England who were surveyed when 20 years later, and it turns out, well, yeah, I kept that small box of things that I'm using, but other than that, I'm not using the rest, so I discarded the rest. Yeah, they go back to community values, community beliefs, and it's as though all of that, that universal education, didn't happen. And by the way, in the United States, there were court cases, some famous people. In some, I remember some years ago, there were some sports figures who sued the university for not giving them a good education. They actually went to court. Said, well, you didn't educate me. I'm suing you for your failure to educate me. So, in other words, what you're addressing was actually been legal cases. And I'm not talking just about the paper mills like Trump University, which were bogus. Give me the money, take this piece of paper. I'm talking about accredited universities, because universities are real universities, are accredited universities where people just did not feel they got anything out of it. Education is human transformation. It's intellectual transformation. It's changing you as a human, making you develop as a human being.
Okay, Mr. Kofas, the questions are finished on my part. If there is any final message regarding to this conversation, please, to the viewers, if there is anything that you want to tell the viewers, if there is any final message regarding that to conclude it, please, you can give a final message to the viewers.
My best thinking right now is that I'll go back to the ancestor who occupied the land where I was born, Socrates, who believed that self-taught, in the age we live in, a person should rely more and more, not just on the institution, because you are going to get exactly as what you're addressing, sadly, by the way, on a world scale, and that is this robotic. And then you discard the rest. You're going to use what you're going to use, and that's it. So if a person wants to be truly educated, you go back to the Socrates model, which is educate yourself. This is, I used to tell my own students, you don't just have to read these books that I assigned and stick to this assignment. Do research for yourself. Go beyond that, find out, challenge what you read, challenge me. What I'm telling you, challenge me. I don't care, this is the purpose of education. It's to exchange ideas. If stifling the exchange of ideas becomes a crime, it becomes illegal, which is where we're headed, by the way. That means that civilization can't advance. Civilization cannot advance on the basis of stopping such freedom of expression and intellectual pursuits and self-discovery, you see. That's my advice.
Okay, so I'm very, very thankful to all the viewers who have been watching this video and listening to this conversation. And I'm also very, very thankful to Mr. Jon Kofas for giving us his precious time and contributing to a very, very important topic related to the international politics and all the circumstances that have resulted from the now we can say 3-month-old war between Israel and Hamas, which in actuality is a 75-year-old issue. In fact, it's going to be 76 years that are going to be completed in this May, because it was in May 1948 when the state of Israel came into being. So it's going to be 76 years after 4 months. And this issue doesn't seem to stop. And what we can just hope, and we can just request the world leaders the international community, all the leaders of the countries, and the governments, the militaries, to take action and to stop this. Because I am afraid personally that if this issue doesn't stop, it may lead to the third world war. We just wish that there is no war. We just don't want any world wars. The two world wars which happened in the 20th century, they brought a lot of destruction to the infrastructure, to the human lives. So many innocent lives were, lost in these wars. War is not the solution to anything. So we should just request and that the world leaders to take action so that the world can live in peace. We can live in a peaceful world where everyone, irrespective of religion, race, color, everyone can live together in harmony. Thank you, Mr. Jon Kofas, and thank you to all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.